This year, Cannondale has introduced some far-reaching changes to its Topstone gravel range, introducing this, the Cannondale Topstone Neo Carbon Lefty Free, a brand new e-gravel bike for the brand that costs £5,000.
Okay, so clearly looking at this bike, there are some pretty unique technologies that you certainly don't see on other gravel or other e-gravel bikes, but there are also some slightly more subtle features that might not jump off the screen as much. So Rupert, can you just take us through some of the defining features of this Cannondale Topstone Neo?
Yes, subtle, not a word I would use to describe this bike. The Lefty Oliver fork at the front end. It's new, it's on this bike and it's also on some of the analog Topstone gravel bikes, so the non-E assisted ones. What it is a 30mm telescopic fork, which is much closer to a mountain biking fork than many other systems used on gravel bikes. And I say it's closer to a mountain biking fork because it is air sprung. So this uses an air spring to control the compression, and you can dial in the rebound adjustment as well, which you can't do on many systems on gravel bikes. Also, it being air sprung means you dial it into rider weight, so it's much more fine-tuned and responsive and supple to rider input than compared to just a sort of a spring or a standard hydraulic damper that might be used in other cases. A really interesting approach because it's situated underneath the bike, so it's much more about absorbing big hits on the trail, and that immediately tells you what type of bike this is. This is a bike that is built to handle basically anything you're brave enough to pedal it at, and that's exactly what the Lefty Oliver does. You can lock it out, so if you're riding on the road, and it does have a sort of, you can blow through it, so if you forget to unlock it before you dive into the trails, you won't just be left with a rigid front end when you're expecting some a bit of squish, shall we say. So very unique. It obviously looks quite complicated, and to some extent it is quite complicated. So to get the wheel out, you have to remove the brake caliper, which you do by flicking down a quick release lever and pulling it off. But you shouldn't really ever have to do that, because one of the good things about this, if you do flat or puncture this while riding, you don't actually need to take it out of the bike. You just prop it up against a tree and you can just work it from one side. It's obviously a really unique look that, depending how adventurous you're feeling, you'll either love or you will be a bit shocked by it. Cannondale have been working on e-road for quite a while now, so they've got quite an expansive e-road bike offering. So they're very good at adapting their carbon frames to accommodate motors and batteries. And it's no different here. They've adapted the Topstone frame to accommodate the Bosch motor system that is housed inside it. The more subtle things would be the kingpin suspension, which remains. So fans of Cannondale's Topstone system will recognize that from previous Topstones. It is 30 mils of, we call it suspension, but it's really flex. It's around a pivot point, which is what that is there. And some structural changes in the carbon fiber in the top tube and the seat stays to allow the bike to flex. So it does pair well with the front end, and does in effect, in Cannondale like to shout this from the rooftops, make this a full suspension e-gravel bike.
That was one major thing I wanted to ask, actually. Looking purely just aesthetically, I'm imagining that you're going to feel that suspension a lot at the front end, whereas at the rear end it's going to be very slightly less noticeable. Is that the case, or do they sort of marry together and kind of feel like you're getting an equal experience across the frame?
You notice the compression more at the front end for sure. That's because it's a telescopic fork, but the fact that it's tuned to rider weight means that you can get a good pairing between the two, because basically the compression on the rear is driven by how much the rider weighs. And if you make that the same on the front, which you can because it's an air sprung fork, you do get like a degree of balance, but the rear is much more subtle. The front comes into play when you're diving off sort of bigger drops or you're hitting roots and rocks, whereas the rear is much more of like a active suspension system. It's for when you're pedaling along rough roads or fire road trails. It's just taking the sting out of the ride quality that bit. So they kind of do a different job. These are 650B wheels in here. You can run it with 700C wheels if you want to. So there is quite a lot of versatility built into the frame that way.
So with this motor, Cannondale has certainly set its position in that, certainly in the mountain bike world, you're very much seeing high torque motors that will help you scramble up those kind of really steep sudden inclines that you find off-road, whereas typically on the road, you'll find much lower torque motors, which will just feel a little bit more natural, allow a slightly more natural cadence at more of a kind of sustainable pace. Now, Cannondale has gone high torque, which implies that this is really a gravel bike that's kind of sitting slightly more towards that mountain bike end of the scale. Can you tell me a bit about the motor, how you found it kind of influenced the ride?
So it is a Bosch Performance Line CX motor in here. It features a 500 watt hour battery. This delivers 85 Newton meters of torque, which is high. It's a lot of torque and you feel it immediately when you start pedaling. This bike is fast and it wants to accelerate very, very quickly. Some people won't love that because it is a bit like the bike is getting away from you somewhat. It's got a real sharp acceleration to it. It kicks in very quickly. You learn to handle it, is what I would say. And it's got 4 modes built into the system. And you just learn that you're probably not going to ride everywhere in the fastest mode. And in fact, when I've been technical climbing on this bike, technical climbing, you might be like, well, you want as much support as you can get, as much power as possible. Actually, I found that wasn't true because you wanted to try and keep the front end down more than you could in its like in the fastest or the mode of most support. So actually I was dialing it back to more like tour mode, which is one from bottom. And that was much more manageable while still delivering you the support you wanted. Where I was really enjoying the turbo mode or the top end mode was on steep tarmac climbs where you just wanted to get up and over them really quickly. You just blip it up and you'd absolutely fly up them. I've always said that e-gravel is a sport in its own right. You're not just learning to technical climb, you're learning to handle a gravel bike. You're learning to handle a gravel bike that has a battery and a motor in it. And it's like you have to learn to manage your equipment as much as you manage your own cardiovascular system or your legs or how much power you can output. And that was highlighted completely by this bike and how you managed its power output through its modes. 500 watt hours is on the larger side for what most gravel bikes would use. You're usually looking at sort of a 320 watt hour battery on the gravel. Bosch does spec some big batteries. This is by nowhere the biggest. I think the biggest Bosch battery tops out at something like 1,250 watt hours. But the range on this is pretty good. If you're careful, Cannondale says you can sort of get over 130k out of it. I typically found on riding about 65 kilometers in different modes, used about 40 to 50% of the battery. So if you fancied that, I reckon you could go for about 120, scaling that up. Yeah, it's quite impressive.
Cool. So we've looked at the frame, we've looked at the really obvious components, the motor and so on. Tell me a bit around the group set. You can see it's GRX and you've got a single ring there. Do you feel that these kind of complemented the ride?
The single ring on this I actually found to be very suitable. It's kind of not really an issue when you're engaging with the motor. It's got a great spread of gears on the back. What you're looking for more is, does it deliver power in line with your cadence? The Bosch system did, and they've just updated it so it does that even more now. The benefit of the 1x system is it's much more silent than a 2x system, which you will benefit from riding this, because if you're hitting roots and rocks harder, you don't want that chain slap. It can be really noisy. The GRX group set is excellent. I think we've come to realize that and we love it. And the GRX brakes are amazing. They're absolutely superb. You have no worries about letting this bike with all of that extra weight go on trails, because they just remain in total control using those brakes. They're really, really impressive. One area of the spec list that I have had issues with were the wheels and tyres on this bike. They'd probably be fine on an analog gravel bike. I'm just not entirely convinced they were sort of up to the extra weight and aggression of this bike. And also the tyres are just a bit too narrow. These are 650B 42mm tyres. Really, I'd be wanting to put wider, go as wide as you can if you're riding this bike. And I'd also go for a more aggressive front tyre. I'd go for something with more spikes on, a bit more tread, because you're just going to really want to maximize your grip when you're riding this downhill. It feels stable because it's very heavy. It picks up speed very quickly, as you might expect. So you need to be aware of that. You don't want to be cranking into trails on this because the pairing of the high torque and the weight is, you might get out your depths quite quickly. I'm not saying I did get out of my depths ever riding this bike. So the e-gravel market is a small but burgeoning niche in the off-road world, shall we say. There's not a huge amount of selection at the moment. And of what there is, the Cannondale Topstone Neo is more expensive. There is reason for that. It is a carbon fiber frame. It's a Ballistic carbon fiber frame. It has the Lefty suspension fork on it, which, as I've said, does give you a different ride quality. It has that Bosch system. It has the suspension built into the frame. There are reasons that this bike costs more than an aluminium e-gravel bike. You do get a degree of versatility with electric bikes that you maybe don't get with analog bikes. You can ride it on the road because it's got that additional support. You can ride it off-road, it's built to do just that. Take it touring. This could really turn into a bit of a mullet bike and do it all kind of beast in many ways. So that's my review of the Cannondale Topstone Neo Carbon Lefty Free, a £5,000 e-gravel bike that is an insane, brilliant, mind-bogglingly good fun bike to ride. You know, I just had so much fun riding this bike that I had to put it on our editor's choice list because I start laughing even when I think back about the rides I did on this and how it makes it feel and how much it makes you want to push what you think you're capable of doing on a gravel bike.
So if you do want to see more of our Editor's Choice reviews, do log on to the Cycling Weekly website because everything we've chosen for our annual award is listed there. Really hope you liked this video. If you did, make us feel good and click that like button. And if you have any comments, any questions, do pop them below as well.